Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring The Space Race. Egocentric Orbit by John Cory. The Railhead at Kysyl, Khoto by Alan Kim Lang. A Pound of Prevention by G.C. Edmondson. Moon Dust by Oliver Saari. Project Hush by William Tenn. Egocentric Orbit by John Cory. Originally published in Astounding Science Fiction, May 1960. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Near the end of his 15th orbit, as Greenland slipped by noiselessly below, he made the routine measurements that tested the operation of his space capsule and checked the automatic instruments which would transmit their stored data to Earth on his next pass over control. Everything normal. All mechanical devices were operating perfectly. This information didn't surprise him. In fact, he really didn't even think about it. The previous orbits and the long simulated flights on Earth during training had made such checks routine and perfect results expected. The capsules were developed by exhaustive testing both on the ground and as empty satellites before entrusting them to carry animals and then the first human. He returned to contemplation of the panorama passing below and above, although, as he noted idly, above and below had lost some of their usual meaning, since his capsule, like all heavenly bodies, was stable in position with respect to the entire universe, and thanks to Sir Isaac Newton and his laws, never changed. The Earth and the stars alternated over his head during each orbit. Up now meant whatever was in the direction of his head. He remembered that even during his initial orbit, when the Earth first appeared overhead, he accepted the fact as normal. He wondered if the other two had accepted it as easily. For there had been 2 men hurled into orbit before he ventured into space. The others, who had also passed the rigorous 3-year training period and were selected on the basis of overall performance to precede him. He had known them both well, and wondered again what had happened on their flights. Of course, they had both returned, depending upon what your definition of return was. The capsules in which they had ventured beyond Earth had returned them living, but this was to be expected, for even the considerable hazards of descent through the atmosphere and the terrible heating which occurred were successfully surmounted by the capsule. Naturally, it had not been expected that the satellites would have to be brought down by command from the ground, but this too was part of the careful planning. Radio control of the retro-rockets that moved the satellite out of orbit by reducing its velocity. Of course, ground control was to be used only if the astronaut failed to ignite the retro-rockets himself. He remembered everyone's surprise and relief when the first capsule was recovered and its occupant found to be alive. They had assumed that in spite of all precautions he was dead, because he had not fired the rockets on the 50th orbit, and it was necessary to bring him down on the 65th. Recovery alive only partially solved the mystery, for the rescuers and all others were met by a haughty, stony silence from the occupant. Batteries of tests confirmed an early diagnosis: complete and utter withdrawal. Absolute refusal to communicate. Therapy was unsuccessful. The second attempt was similar in most respects, except that command return was made on the 31st orbit after the astronaut's failure to deorbit at the end of the 30th. His incoherent babble of moons, stars, and worlds was no more helpful than the first. Test after test confirmed that no obvious organic damage had been incurred by exposure outside of the Earth's protective atmosphere. Biopsy of even selected brain tissues seemed to show that microscopic cellular changes due to prolonged weightlessness or primary cosmic ray bombardment which had been suggested by some authorities, were unimportant. Somewhat reluctantly, it was decided to repeat the experiment a third time. The launching was uneventful. He was sent into space with the precision he expected. The experience was exhilarating, and, although he had anticipated each event in advance, he could not possibly have foreseen the overpowering feeling that came over him. Weightlessness he had experienced for brief periods during training, but nothing could match the heady impression of continuous freedom from gravity. Earth passing overhead was also to be expected from the simple laws of celestial mechanics, but his feeling as he watched it now was inexpressible. It occurred to him that perhaps this was indeed why he was here, because he could appreciate such experiences best. He had been told the stars would be bright, unblinking, and an infinitude in extent, but could mere descriptions of photographs convey the true seeing? On his 21st orbit, he completed his overseeing the entire surface of the planet in daylight. He had seen more of Earth than anyone able to tell about it, but only he had the true feeling of it. The continents were clearly visible, as were the oceans and both polar ice caps. The shapes were familiar, but in only a remote way. A vague indistinctness born of distance served to modify the outlines, and he alone was seeing and understanding. On the dark side of the planet, large cities were marked by indistinct light areas which paled to insignificance compared to the stars and his sun. He speculated about the others who had only briefly experienced these sights. Undoubtedly, they weren't as capable of fully grasping or appreciating any of these things as he was. It was quite clear that no one else but he could encompass the towering feeling of power and importance generated by being alone in the universe. At the end of the 25th orbit, he disabled the radio control of the retro rockets and sat back with satisfaction to await the next circuit of his Earth around him. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Railhead at Kysyl, Khoto, by Alan Kim Lang, originally published in Infinity, November 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. I've been told that during the season of the Simoom winds in Morocco, Arab judges let confessed murderers off with a fine. The weather justifies homicide. Washington judges should be as lenient in the summer, I thought, scooting on the contours of my chair to keep the seat of my pants from sweating into the varnish. $10 and costs seemed a fair price to pay society if I killed this Dr. Francis von Munger. My cigarettes had become limp and brown with the sweat through my shirt. I eased one of these unappetizing noodles out of the pack and lit it. It tasted like burning, damp wool stockings. I picked up an ancient magazine to keep from staring at the blonde receptionist, the only object in the waiting room upon which the eye could rest with comfort. I'd viewed all the cartoons without smiling, and was working my way through the ads when the blonde picked over my magazine. "Dr. von Munger will see you now, Dr. Huguenard," she said. "Damn right he will," I growled, slapping the magazine down and trailing the blonde into the Holy of Holies. Inside, an efficient young woman sat behind an efficient steel desk. She looked insultingly cool. "How much of von Munger's typewriter pool do I have to work through before I get to see the great man in the flesh?" I demanded of the cool-looking redhead. "Have a cigar, Dr. Huguenard," the girl said, tipping a cylindrical humidor my way, "and sit down," indicating the chair that squatted beside her desk. "I've got news for you, Huguenard. I'm von Munger, The first name is Francis, with an E. Makes all the difference. I accepted the cigar, crushed my woolsock cigarette in the ashtray, and leaned back silent to indicate my availability for further astonishments. "I suppose you wonder why you were sent here," she began. I murmured something about Washington's being delightful to visit in mid-June, whatever the occasion might be. She ignored this subtlety. "We've needed a rocket engineer in economics analysis for some time," she said. "Recent developments have made your employment here imperative." I lit the cigar slowly. "I've been led to believe that her work at White Sands was important too," I said through my smoke. Von Munger looked as put out as though I'd belched during the invocation at an ambassadorial tea party. She took a deep breath, a pretty process despite the mannish suit she was wearing, and launched into her sales talk. "Dr. Huguenard, our work here in the Commerce Department's Special Bureau of Economic Analysis is the most important work in the world. If a war is fought, we will win it. If that war is prevented, we will have prevented it." I'd seen this sort of megalomania displayed by chiefs of paperwork before, but never in a more acute form. I smiled. This little redhead obviously saw herself as a sort of benign Lucretia Borgia, erecting a fortress of filing cabinets around the American way. "I'm glad you smiled, Dr. Huguenard," she said. "I was afraid that your face was all scar tissue and just wouldn't bend." "You're pretty too," I snarled. The damp heat had leached the last vestiges of chivalry from my soul. "Get on with your pitch, will you? I want to turn your job down and get back to my air-conditioned lab in New Mexico." "Give me 5 minutes to persuade you to stay," she said, making a steeple with her fingertips and resting the steeple against her chin. I checked my wristwatch. "The SBEA is responsible for a special type of strategic intelligence," she said. "We are analyzing the economic processes of the USSR. "I am familiar with the multiplication table," I said. "Otherwise I don't see how I can be of use to you. My specialty is rocket fuel injection systems. I'd dearly love to get back to that." "You're cutting into my 300 seconds of grace, Dr. Huguenard," she protested. I sucked bitterly on the cigar she'd given me. "Okay," I sighed through the smoke. "Continue, Professor." "Money to a nation is like blood to a man," she said. "This is true even in Russia's manipulative economy. Were you to trace the movement of blood through the human body, you'd soon know its every tissue. Just so, by tracing the flow of wealth through the USSR, we can discover precisely what's going on over there. We have overt means of observations, such as the Soviet studies published in Industria Sovetskaya Metallurgia Voprosi Ekonomiki and other journals, and we have our clandestine sources as well." "Do you read Russian?" I asked, feeling a little more respect for this miss with a PhD. "Russian, Polish, German, and French," she said impatiently. "I was born in Gdansk, near Danzig, a community where being a polyglot is simple self-preservation. But I'd best get on. My time is running low." "Take 10 minutes," I said grandly. 15. But where do I come in?" She lit a cigarette and went on. "This office is concerned with the economic processes taking place within the Truvinian Autonomous Region of the RSFSR, an area that makes the Dakota Badlands look like Miami Beach. The capital city of this region is Kysyl, Khoto. We have a tourist there." "Tourist?" I asked. "A covert source of information," Dr. von Munger explained. "If I keep giving you secrets, you'll have to stay here." "I know all about this cloak and dagger stuff," I told her. "I read the Gold Bug when I was 12. "Our informant recently transmitted this message," she said, handing me a sheet of paper. On it were typewritten 6 Russian words and a number. I'd remembered enough from my conversational Russian 101 to coax the Cyrillic puzzle into English. "Kysyl," I read aloud. "That must be a proper name. Railhead. K.E. Zyolkovsky. 5,000 meters second. Lunar." I handed the paper back to the good-looking Dr. von Munger. "The boy who sent this note takes the brass cup for brevity. What's it all mean?" Luna is in Russian what it was in Latin, she explained, just in case I'd missed that point. Do you know who Tsiolkovsky was? Sure, I said. Konstantin Eduardovich Tsiolkovsky hatched the notion of spaceships back about 1900. The Reds must be naming their bird in his honor. Dr. von Munger, you're beginning to get through to me. I took the paper back from her to check it. 5,000 meters per second. If that's delivered exhaust velocity, the mass ratio would be 26 lifted for 1 delivered. They must be using ozone to get that. If they're using ozone, they've got an inhibitor to hold it stable. If this all means what it seems to, they can make the moon in 2 steps, and it's about time someone did. Dr. von Munger shook her head. I'm happy that you derive so great a pleasure from the notion of a flight to the moon, she said. But you're forgetting that this rocket belongs to the Russians. They won't be inviting any of us Yankees to join them in admiring the view from the rim of Copernicus. We'll be looking up, Dr. Huguenard. They'll be looking down at us on a 5-to-1 power gradient. That'll put your intercontinental ballistic missile out of the woodshed behind the washboard, won't it? Have you reported to the boys in blue? I asked. Not yet, she said. My chief agrees that we need a rocket specialist to evaluate what we have. That's where you came in from New Mexico, dragging your feet every inch of the way. The chief has given us 2 weeks to prepare a dossier on the Konstantin Eduardovich Tsiolkovsky. 2 weeks from now, Dr. Huguenard, you're to have the plans for that ship ready for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I couldn't blueprint a rowboat in that short a time, I said. Not if I had to work on guesses. They're intelligent guesses, Doctor, she reminded me. I've got figures for every ton of rail freight shipped from Krasnoyarsk to Abakan, figures sweated out of official Soviet publications. All you've got to do is take the information I give you and use it to build a paper rocket, okay? I nodded doubtfully. With information like this, it shouldn't be hard to get the JCS flapping their shoulder boards like taxiing Goonie birds. This should scare 'em good. It scares me. With good reason, Dr. Huguenard, she said. Pretty girl, I thought. Huguenard, you're a hot-tempered, couthless dog to come in bullying this chick the way you did. Since we're on the same job now, I said in my best oil-on-the-waters tone, you may as well call me Frank, save syllables. And while we're chumming it up, Dr. von Munger, how's about having dinner with me this evening? We should be able to find an air-conditioned restaurant in this swamp town. Thank you, Frank, she said. You may call me Francis. And I have dinner with you, thank you, in the cafeteria downstairs. We'll be working late every evening for the next 2 weeks. She nodded, pressed the button that popped the blonde in from the reception room, and smiled in a way that suggested that she'd next smile when my complete report lay on her desk. The blonde took me in tow to a desk equipped with a file drawer full of Russian language clippings, folders marked secret, and my own little safe to keep these goodies in. I had a shelf of Russian-English dictionaries and an adding machine to help me bring Cosmos out of chaos. The files looked like a well-stirred newspaper morgue, in Russian yet. After the blonde had left, I noticed that my desk, too, had a button mounted to one side. I pushed it experimentally. The blonde reappeared. I waved my hand at the clippings on my desk. Will I have any help in translating this stuff? I asked her. My Russian is the hands up, me American variety. I'm to help you with that, the blonde told me. Just call for me, Joyce, when you've got something you can't make out. I used to be a UN interpreter. She smiled and left me to my sorrows. I felt like a dirty, cigar-smoking male illiterate. Probably half the Stinos had been engineers at Peenemünde. I needed a dumb girlfriend, I decided, just to protect me from the acute inferiority feelings these stuffed Einsteins were giving me. I soothed my ego by going to work. I began with the journal clippings. Most of these had little tags attached, giving in English translation abstracts of material dealing with the Tuvinian Autonomous Region. There was a detailed map of Kysyl Khoto, complete with the names of the bars the engineers drank their vodka in. I had notes on how many pounds of Turkish tobacco, 1,250, had been used there in 1955, and how many bathtubs shipped there that year, 714. I wondered how many of those bathtubs they'd have aboard the Konstantin Eduardovich Tsiolkovsky. Let them take showers, I decided. By the end of the week, I'd sifted the information I thought pertinent to the KEZ from the incidental chaff of Tuvinian life, like those bathtubs. This whole business was like juggling invisible balls. The very fact that Kysyl Khoto had been reached by a spur track of the Uzib Railroad had been lifted from only 2 lines in Stahl's midsummer issue, supported, of course, by the laconic note of Dr. von Munger's mysterious Central Asian correspondent. A 2-step rocket was the thing to build. That was evident from the reported exhaust velocity. That low zone, liquid ozone, 1 2/3 as much fuel per cubic foot as garden-variety liquid oxygen, Aussie oxidizers seemed a good bet. What was the fuel? Hydrogen could give 5,000 miles per second, but would be almost impossibly tricking to use with ozone. Hydrazine seemed a better bet. There were memos of several tons of nitric acid being shipped from Krasnoyarsk to Abakan to Kysyl Khoto, together with a batch of nitrate fertilizers ostensibly bound for the Golden Fleece kolkhoz at Karabuluk. I wondered what they raised on that collective farm. The sort of crops that grow best at white sands, I imagine. With a lot of ammonia and a passel of electricity, they could simmer out hydrazine where they were going to use it. I designed the fuel tanks necessary to pay the way to the moon in hydrazine and low zone, then sketched a ship around them. 2 stages, as I decided. Here a serious discrepancy came in. I had more steel, more wolfram, more of anything than a KEZ could possibly need. I took the problem to my pretty boss, glad for the chance to visit. "It would seem," Francis said, looking over my notes, "that they've shipped enough material to Kysyl Khoto to build 3 ships. Let's assume that they're doing just this. It's one way to get home from the moon, I should think. They'd send 3 ships there, each carrying enough extra fuel to drive one of them back to Earth after they've planted the flag and geigered around a bit. Or possibly they intend setting up a permanent station there." "It seems to me that we're whistling up a lot of smoke from this little fire," I protested. "We don't know the material they're using to keep the rocket throats from melting. The notes on rail shipments from Krasnoyarsk mention ceramics. I don't think that's detailed enough to work into a boogeyman to scare the JCS." I reached over her desk to swipe a cigar from a cylinder, remarking, "It's nice of you to keep these on hand, seeing as you smoke cools." "Got to keep the staff happy?" Francis smiled. "Let's be making more of an effort," I suggested. "How about that dinner tonight? It's Saturday, you know." "All right, Frank." She jotted her address on the corner of an empty confidential cover sheet and handed it to me. 8 o'clock, she said. I went back to work, refreshed by the prospect of an extramural session with the shapely Dr. Francis von Munger. It proved an interesting evening. Despite her polyglot propensities and monumental economic erudition, Francis von Munger had never drunk a Negroni cocktail, never cracked a lobster. Later, I discovered that she danced as though she'd heard of the art, but had never practiced it before. So mostly we sat and talked. We swapped genealogies and reminisced over our school days. Frances had been the only girl in a class of boy engineers at a freshwater college in Indiana, I discovered. She got her B.S. in mechanical before she'd gone to Chicago to study economics. I grinned sheepishly at this, remembering the times I'd explained my simple math procedures to her as though she'd been a dewy-eyed home economics girl. But why did you drop engineering? I wanted to know. It wasn't going anywhere, she said. A cryptic statement, but I left it alone. Well, I took the boss home and kissed her good night, and hummed Verdi overtures in the taxi all the way home. In the morning, of course, she'd be the same school-marmish dame she'd always been, the government girl in the grey flannel suit, decorative but distant. Back at my cluttered desk the next morning, facing the medley of newspaper clippings and half-baked hypotheses that represented my contribution to economic analysis, spaceship division, I felt a cold wave of panic. In 6 days, I'd have to stand at a table decked by admirals and generals and expose this flimsy structure of Sunday work to their merited contempt. I tugged out my file marked propulsion system and leafed through it. I was as clever as that Dutch paleontologist who reconstructed the greater blue-eyed auk from a single petrified tail feather. I'd shuffled a mess of inferences taken from the journals of a nation not too celebrated for guilelessness, dropped them in a hat, and pulled out a spaceship by the ears. For all I knew, really knew, the Reds could be propelling the KEZ with twisted rubber bands. I was supposed to be building the ship the way I'd built it, if I had the gear delivered by that overworked railhead at Kysyl Khoto. If I were a Russian-trained engineer, if I had my ear at the Kremlin's keyhole and my hand in its till, and if our intelligence wasn't a fiction born of paperwork. Okay. Back into the desk went the propulsion file, while my keen engineering mind relaxed by considering the dimensions of Dr. Francis Monmunga. After a while, I got out the old copy of Das Mars Project and finagled its statistics to make them fit a mere hop to the moon. Since my presentation wasn't intended to be operational, I decided it might as well be artistic. My half hour with the JCS was a day away when I came down with acute cold feet up to the knees. I went to see Frances for encouragement and to scrounge a cigar. "Let's not kid ourselves," I told her. "Those brass hats are clever. Why don't we just turn over the facts to them, let their intelligence take over? I'd like to stay with the KEZ research, but I'd also like more and tighter facts. What are the throats of the rockets made of? What fuel are they using, for sure? If they've decided on ozone, how do they keep it from exploding every time a commissar sneezes? Francis, let's just hand my scrapbooks to the Air Force and let it fill in the blank pages. I hate to present this comic book continuity I've got as a serious extrapolation from known facts." "Sit down, Franklin," she said, handing me the cigar I'd come for. "You're a babe in the woods, as far as intelligence is concerned. That's with a capital I, Frank." "Thank you, teacher. I want the military to take this Zyolkovsky thing and shake it till it falls into shape. But they won't, Frank, not unless we persuade them that it's important. That's what you're doing, window dressing to make the big brass buy this and stamp it high priority. If they had what we've worked from, it would get a D rating. They'd set to work on it once the definitive study of Kyrgyz folk dancing was done. They'd give it to a second lieutenant to play with Wednesday afternoons, and forget it. But you think your opinion that the Russians have a spaceship squatting somewhere in the Altais is justification for your twisting a haggle of admirals around your pretty finger?" "I have a feeling for intelligence work," she said. "This is hot, Frank. Get back to your desk and plan a drawing of the KEZ. Better yet, sketch a model of the beast. We'll have one built for you to stand on the table as you talk tomorrow. It'll give you confidence." "Now I'm a confidence man." "In good cause, Frank. Tomorrow, after you've made your presentation to the JCS, we'll have dinner together to celebrate, at my place." At this last prospect, I went back to work with spirits refreshed as no 5-cent drink can refresh them. I was a minor event on the schedule of JCS interviews. Half an hour, from 12 till 12:30, they'd given me. I'd hoped I'd spoil their appetites for lunch. My model of the Konstantin Eduardovich Zyolkovsky, its lacquer still a little tacky, bulged my briefcase. I had to persuade a Marine lieutenant that it wasn't a bomb I was carrying before he'd let me into the conference room. There were maps on the walls, covered with grey dust sheets, as though even the face of Mother Earth was being protected as an American secret. The High Air Force was smoking cigars. The High Navy ran more for pipes, while the Army's big wheels burned nervous yards of cigarettes. 2 waves sat at opposite corners of the big table, their fingers poised for slow dances over the stenotype keyboards. The brass regarded me, as craggy-faced as though I was suspected of giving Uncle Nikita the keys to Fort Knox. I opened my briefcase, set the model on the floor, and launched into my story. You've doubtless heard echoes through channels of recent activity in the Trevinian Division of the Commerce Department's Special Bureau of Economics Analysis, I began. Until 3 weeks ago, I was employed at White Sands as an engineer on Project Gargantua. I was transferred to TD-SBEA DC to make evaluation of information which may make Project Gargantua obsolete. I knew I had my audience when an Air Force general dropped his cigar. As you know, the highest peak of the all-time mountains is 15,000 feet tall, high enough to be of help in rocket research. The capital city of the Trevinian Autonomous Region is Kysyl, Khoto. This city has only recently become involved in industrial activity. Analysis of the materials being shipped to Kysyl, Khoto, together with specific information furnished from covert sources, leads us to believe that this activity is concerned with rocket research. Our tentative conclusion is that the Soviets have several large rocket ships in construction there. One of these, named the Konstantin Eduardovich Tsiolkovsky, is intended to reach the moon. The reported exhaust velocity makes it very likely that they will succeed within the next 3 years. I lifted the model of the KEZ and set it on the table so that the big red star on its middle was conspicuous. Our time has been too short and our information too slight to allow me to give you details. Nevertheless, the Russians undoubtedly are building a spaceship. General Turner, USAF, who had been a time cover boy several times, tamped a cigarette on the table. "Exactly how much of this model is guesswork, Dr. Huguenard?" he demanded. 95%, I said. "There's a lot of room for worry in that 5% that's left, though. I hardly think the Russians can have been so devious as to have planted false leads in several hundred of their own journals." The chairman nodded. "That will be all, Dr. Huguenard," he said. "I expect we'll be calling upon you later." That parting note had an ominous ring, I thought, carrying my toy spaceship past the Marine Guard. Would they bring handcuffs along next time? My desk at the office had been emptied. I leaned on the button to buzz Joyce, my blonde interpreter. "We were given an order by the Secretary of Commerce," she reported. "He told us to turn over everything on the KEZ to Air Force Intelligence. A squadron of air police packed all your papers and took off with them half an hour ago." I went in to see Frances. She stood at the window, looking at the cars passing on the avenue. Her hands were together, the knuckles white with strain. "You did it, Frances," I said. "All the big guns of USAF intelligence are being zeroed on a little town in Central Asia. If they find our guesses were true, we'll start building a moonship too. That's what you really want, isn't it?" "Yes, Frank," she said, turning to me. "I want our people to get to the moon. This seems a shoddy way to start, though." "You're right," I admitted. "An armament race isn't an edifying spectacle. But the discovery of America was inspired more by money grubbers than by idealists, Frances." I pried her hands apart and took them in mine. "Let's go, Frances. There's no work here today. Do you have the drinks at your place to celebrate our victory?" She burst into tears. I held her close till she sobbed herself calm, ignoring the telephone buzzing on her desk. No one could have business with Francis von Munger more important than mine. By some quiddity of feminine logic, Frances stored her scotch in the refrigerator. I broke it out and poured 2 stiff shots into water glasses. I carried them into the living room, where she was sitting stiff and straight on the sofa, like a frightened little girl. "Have some anodyne, Frances. Forget the Department of Commerce and the all-time mountains. We've done all we can. We've tossed the ball." She took the drink and set it untasted on the arm of the sofa. "That's not it, Frank. You know the message from a tourist in Tuva? That note that put the seal of approval on your project? You wrote that yourself, didn't you? The Railhead, the spaceship. They all exist only under that golden hair of yours, right?" Frances stared at me as though she expected me to whip out an Army .45 and cover her with it. "Frank, how do you know?" "Until I met you, Frances, I thought dreams of space were male dreams. Then I found a girl who'd become an engineer, who'd then given up engineering to go into intelligence work. Curious. Then the business of the secret message from the USSR. Instead of turning it over to the Air Force for immediate evaluation, you chose to elaborate on it by means of a technical study, and even got your boss to push through a priority call for me. Curiouser yet." "If you find out, they can," she said dully. "I had the advantage of being in love with you, Frances. I've watched you closely, very closely. We'll have a few weeks or months before they discover that you've phoned information to goad our men into space. We've got time enough for a honeymoon, Frances." The phone rang. Damn Alexander Graham Bell, I thought. I picked the monster up and barked, "Hello." It was the Secretary of Commerce. I introduced myself. He deigned to relay his message through me. "Please inform Dr. von Munger that her department has been transferred to the Department of Air Force at White Sands, New Mexico," the secretary said. "She and you are to report there immediately." I thanked the man nicely and hung up. Frances was standing now. "We're going to White Sands," I told her. "We're going to help see that the man in the moon is American." Frances took the drink out of my hand and set it on the bookcase to free my arms for holding her. "Maybe, Frank," she said. "The first man on Mars will be a Huguenot. I'll be proud to assist you in that project." The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. A Pound of Prevention by G.C. Edmondson. Originally published in Infinity, April 1958. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Without his hat, General Karnhauser was just a tired old man. 3 men sat at the other side of the table. "No use trying to gloss it over," he said. The young men nodded. If this shot failed, it might be 100 years before Congress could be conned into another appropriation. The 3 young men had an even better reason not to fail. They were going to be in the rocket. Hagstrom spoke. "There were no technical difficulties in the previous shots." "Right," the general said. "Takeoffs proceeded according to schedule. Orbital corrections were made. Then everybody settled down for a 4-month wait. When deceleration time came, the shot was still in the groove." "We know," Vandenberg said tiredly. He worked a microscopic speck of dirt from under a fingernail. There was a loud snap as he snipped the nail off. He stared at the general, a lean forefinger to one side of his ascetic nose. "I'm no expert," the general said wearily. "When you reach my age, they turn you into an office boy." Hagstrom lit a cigarette. "It's tomorrow, isn't it?" The general nodded. "They're loading now." The third man's slight build and bushy black hair belied his mestizo origins. "I still don't think much of those rations," he said. Hagstrom laughed suddenly. "You aren't going to con me into eating pickled fire bombs for 4 months. If I lived on prune soup and codfish balls, I'd make no cracks about Mexican food," Arechaga grunted. "You squareheads don't appreciate good cooking." "You won't get any good cooking in zero gravity," the general said. They got up and filed out the door, putting on their caps in military manners. Outside, trucks clustered at the base of a giant gantry. Arejaga shuddered as a forklift dropped a pallet of bagged meat on the gantry platform. The meat was irradiated and sealed in transparent plastic, but the habits of a lifetime in the tropics do not disappear in spite of engineering degrees. All that meat and not a fly in sight, he thought. It doesn't look right. Multiple staged rockets had gone the way of square sail and piston engines when a crash program poured 22 megabucks into a non-mechanical shield. Piles now diverted 4% of the output into a field which reflected neutrons back into the pile instead of absorbing them. Raised the reaction rate, and the field tightened. Those sudden statewide evacuations in the early years of the century were now remembered only by TV writers. A liquid metal heat exchanger transferred energy to the reaction mass, which a turbine pump was drawing from a fire hydrant. Since the hydrant was fed from a seawater still, there was no need for purification. The last load of provisions went up, and an asepsis party rode the gantry, burdened with their giant vacuum cleaners and germicidal apparatus. "They'll seal everything but the control room," the general said. "When you go aboard, there'll only be one compartment to sterilize." "I still think it's a lot of hogwash," Arejaga said. "They can't have us carrying any bugs with us," Vandenberg said tiredly. "The Martians might put us in quarantine," Hagström added sourly. "If there are any Martians, and if we get there," Arejaga groused. "Now, boys," the general began. "Oh, save it, Pop," Hagström said. "Let's be ourselves as long as the public relations pests aren't around." "Anybody going to town?" Vandenberg asked. "I am," Arejaga said. "Maybe quite a while before I get another plate of fried beans." "Check up at 0400, the general reminded. Hagström went to BOQ. Vandenberg and Arejaga caught the bus into town and lost each other until midnight, when they caught the same bus back to the base. "What's in the sack?" Hagström asked. "Snack," Arejaga said. "I can't stand that insipid slop in the BOQ mess." "Looks like a lot of snack to eat between now and daybreak." "Don't worry, I've got quite an appetite." At 03:45, an orderly knocked on 3 doors in bachelor officers' quarters, and 3 young men made remarks which history will delete. They showered, shaved, and spat toothpaste. At 0400, they walked into the medical officer's door. A red-eyed corpsman reached for a manometer, and the 3 men began taking their clothes off. 15 minutes later, the doctor, a corpulent middle-aged man in disgustingly good humour for 0400, walked in with a cheery good morning. He poked and tapped while the corpsman drew blood samples. "Turn your face and cough," he said. "You think I'm going to develop hernia from riding a nightmare?" Hagström growled. "You did all this yesterday." "An ounce of prevention," the doctor said cheerfully. "A pound of bull," Vandenberg grunted. "Now, boys, what if that got in the papers?" asked a voice from the doorway. "Damn the papers," they greeted the general. "Do we get breakfast?" Arejaga asked. "You'll take acceleration better without it." "Tell my stomach that." "Bend over the table," the doctor said. "Oh, my aching back," Hagström moaned. "That's not the exact target, but you're close. And away we go," the doctor chanted as he drove the needle home. Each man received an injection of antibiotics and drank a paper cupful of anise-flavoured liquid. "Don't we get wrapped in cellophane?" Arejaga asked. "You'll be pure enough when that purgative goes through you." They dressed and rode in the general's staff car to the base of the gantry. As the car stopped, the general said, "Well, boys, I hope you don't expect a speech." "We love you too, Pop," Vandenberg said. They shook hands and stepped aboard the gantry platform. Hagström muttered, and they faced a telescopic TV pickup with mechanical grins until the rising platform shielded them. Each had his own control board, and each was prepared to take over another's duties if necessary. They took off the baggy coveralls and tossed them into lockers. Arechagas made an odd clunk. He hitched up his shorts and turned quickly. They checked each other's instruments and settings, then went to the couches. A clock with an extra hand ticked the seconds off backward. "We're ready," Vandenberg muttered into a throat mic. "So are we," a speaker answered tinnily. The second hand began its final revolution in reverse. With blast-off, it would begin turning in its proper direction. There was a clang as a water hose dropped its magnetic nipple. The rumbling became louder, and the G-meter climbed to 3.5. After several minutes, the needle dropped suddenly to 2. Arechaga tried to lift his head, but decided it wasn't worth the effort. The rumbling stopped, and he knew the sudden panic of free fall. He made the adjustments which controlled arc flights and free-fall parachute jumps had taught him and unstrapped. The speaker's tinny voice read off numbers which they transmuted into turns of 2 wheels with axes at right angles. Since the weight of the remaining reaction mass could not be calculated with exactitude, they spun by trial and error the last few turns until a telescope parallel to the thrust axis zeroed on a 3rd magnitude pinpoint whose spectroscope matched the tinny voice's demands. "Why such a razzy speaker?" Hagström groused as he spun a wheel. "A paper cone gets mush-mouthed in 3Gs, Vandenberg grunted. Arechaga set the pump for 1.6 seconds at 4 liters. He nodded. Hagström pulled the rods. Weight returned briefly, then they floated again. Vandenberg belched. The tinny voice approved, and Hagström dropped the cadmium rods again. "Anybody for canasta?" Arechaga asked. The first day, nobody ate. Overtrained, blasé. Still, it was the first time, and the stomach had yet to make peace with the intellect. The second day, Arechaga broke the pantry door seals and studied the invoices. He gave a groan of disgust and went back to sleep. With something solid strapped in on top, it was almost easy. On the third day, Vandenberg put bags of steak and string beans into the hi-fi oven and strapped himself into a chair. He used chopsticks to snare the globules of soup and coffee which escaped from hooded cups despite all precautions. "How is it?" Hagström asked. "It'd taste better if you'd come down and sit on the same side of the ship." Human factors had recommended that tables and chairs be situated in one plane and resemble the real thing. The sight of one's fellow man at ease in an impossible position was not considered conducive to good digestion. Hagström dived across the room, and in a moment Arechaga joined him. Arechaga sampled the steak and vegetables and turned up his nose. He broke seals and resurrected pork, beef, onions, garlic, and 16 separate spices. There was far too much sancocha for one meal when he was through. "What'll you do with the rest of it?" Hagström asked. "Eat it tomorrow." "It'll spoil." "In this embalmed atmosphere?" Arechaga asked. He sampled the stew. "Irradiated food. Pfui!" He went to his locker and extracted a jar. "What's that?" Vandenberg asked. "Salsa picante." Literal translation, shredding sauce, Hagström volunteered. "Guaranteed to do just that to your taste buds." "Where'd you get it?" Vandenberg asked. "Out of my locker." "Not sterile, I presume." "You're darn tootin' it ain't. I'm not going to have the only tasty item on the menu run through that irradiator." "Out with it!" Vandenberg roared. "Oh, come now," Arechaga said. He poured salsa over the stew and took a gigantic bite. "I hate to pull my rank, but you know what the pill rollers have to say about unsterilized food." "Oh, all right," Arechaga said morosely. He emptied the jar into the disposal and activated the locks. The air loss gave the garbage a gradually diverging orbit. He began cranking the aligning wheels. When the stars stopped spinning, he threw a switch and began reading rapidly into a mic. Finished, he handed the mic to Hagström. Hagström gave his report and passed it to Vandenberg. Adchaga rewound the tape and threaded the spool into another machine. He strapped himself before a telescope and began twiddling knobs. Outside, a microwave dish waggled. He pressed a trigger on one of the knobs. Tape screamed through the transmitter pickup. "Make it?" Hagström asked. "It began to wander off toward the end," Adchaga said. He switched the transmitter off. The temperature had risen in the 4 minutes necessary to squirt, and the sunward side was getting uncomfortable even through the insulation. Hagström began spinning the wheel. Adchaga fed tape into the receiver and played it back slowly. There was background noise for a minute, then, "ETV1, read you loud and clear." There was a pause. Then a familiar voice came in. "Glad to hear from you, boys. Thule and Kerguelen stations tracked you for several hours. Best shot so far. Less than 2 seconds of corrective firing," the general said proudly. Hagström and Vandenberg returned to their books. Adchaga snapped off the player and went into the pantry. The light dimmed and brightened as the spin exposed and occulted its accumulator. He filed the information subconsciously for his revision list and glared at the provisions. Shelves were filled, meats, vegetables, fruits, all held in place by elastic netting. The skin-tight plastic was invisible in the dim light. Adchaga began to feel prickly as the lack of ventilation wrapped him in a layer of steam. All that food right out in the open, and no flies. "It just isn't right," he thought. He shrugged and picked out 3 apples. "Keep the doctor away?" he asked as he swam back into the control room. Hagström nodded and caught one. "Thanks, I'm not hungry," Vandenberg said. He put his book under the net and began taking his own pulse. "Something wrong?" Adchaga asked. "Must have been something I ate," he grunted. Hagström eyed his half-eaten apple with distaste. "I must have eaten some too." He threw the apple into the disposal and belched. Adchaga looked at him worriedly. 2 days passed. Hagström and Vandenberg sampled food fretfully. Adchaga evacuated the disposal twice in 6 hours and watched them worriedly. "Are you guys thinking the same thing I am?" he asked. Vandenberg stared for a moment. "Looks that way, doesn't it?" Hagström started to say something, then dived for a bag and vomited. In a moment he wiped his mouth and turned a pale face toward Adchaga. "This is how it started with the others, isn't it?" he said. Adchaga began talking into the recorder. He killed spin long enough to squirt. In a few minutes the Razzie speaker again made them part of Earth. "And hope for the best," the general was saying. "Maybe you'll adjust after a few days." The voice faded into background noise, and Adchaga tuned off the player. "Any ideas?" he asked. "You know as much medicine as I do." Vandenberg and Hagström shook their heads listlessly. "There's got to be a reason," Adchaga insisted. "How do you feel?" "Hungry. Like I hadn't eaten for 2 weeks." "The same," Hagström said. "Every time I eat it lays like a ton of lead. I guess we just aren't made for zero grav." "Doesn't seem to be hitting me as quickly as it did you two," Adchaga mused. "Can I get you anything?" They shook their heads. He went into the library and began skimming through the medical spools. When he returned, the others slept fitfully. He ate a banana and wondered guiltily if his salsa had anything to do with it. He decided it didn't. The other crews had died the same way without any non-sterile food aboard. He floated back into the pantry and stared at the mounds of provisions until the mugginess drove him out. 3 more days passed. Hagström and Vandenberg grew steadily weaker. Adechaga waited expectantly, but his own appetite didn't fail. He advanced dozens of weird hypotheses, racial immunity, mutations. Even to his non-medical mind, the theories were fantastic. Why should a mestizo take 0 grav better than a European? He munched on a celery stalk and wished he were back on Earth, preferably in Mexico where food was worth eating. Then it hit him. He looked at the others. They'll die anyway. He went to work. 3 hours later, he prodded Hagström and Vandenberg into wakefulness and forced a murky liquid into them. They gagged weakly, but he persisted until each had taken a swallow. 30 minutes later, he forced a cup of soup into each. They dozed, but he noted with satisfaction that their pulses were stronger. 4 hours later, Hagström awoke. "I'm hungry," he complained. Adechaga fed him. The Netherlander came to a little later, and Adechaga was run ragged feeding them for the next 2 days. On the 3rd days, they were preparing their own meals. "How come it didn't hit you?" Vandenberg asked. "I don't know," Adechaga said. "Just lucky, I guess." "What was that stuff you gave us?" Hagström asked. "What stuff?" Adechaga said innocently. "By the way, I raised hell with the inventory getting you guys back in condition. Would you mind going into the far pantry and straightening things up a little?" They went, pulling their way down the passage to the rearmost food locker. "There's something very funny going on," Hagström said. Vandenberg inspected the stocks and the inventory list suspiciously. "Looks all right to me. I wonder why he wanted us to check it." They looked at each other. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Hagström asked. Vandenberg nodded. They pulled themselves silently along the passageway back to the control room. Adechaga was speaking softly into the recorder, his back to the entrance. Hagström cleared his throat, and the black-haired little man spun guiltily. Vandenberg reached for the playback switch. "It's just a routine report," Adechaga protested. "We're curious," Hagström said. The recorder began playing. "I should have figured it right from the start. If food is so lousy the flies won't touch it, then humans have no business eating it." "What's the food got to do with it?" Hagström asked. "Quiet," Vandenberg hissed. "Got by all right on Earth where there was plenty of reinfection, but when you sealed us in this can without a bug in a million miles," Adechaga's voice continued, "if food can't rot, it can't digest either. Irradiate it, burn the last bit of life out of it, and then give us a whopping dose of antibiotics until there isn't one bug in our alimentary tracts from one end to the other. It's no wonder we were starving in the midst of plenty." "Wait a minute. How come you didn't get sick?" Hagström asked. Adechaga flipped a switch, and the recorder ground to a stop. "I reinfected myself with a swallow of salsa picante. Good, old-fashioned, unsanitary chili sauce." A horrible suspicion was growing in Vandenberg's mind. "What did you give us?" he asked. "You left me little choice when you threw out my salsa," Adechaga said. "Why do you have to be so curious?" "What was it?" Vandenberg demanded. "I scraped a little salsa scum from the inside of the disposal. It made a fine culture. What did you think I gave you?" "I'd rather not answer that," Vandenberg said weakly.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
Moondust by Oliver Saari. Originally published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, Winter 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. "Come in, Jessup! Come in, Jessup!" the voice said over and over. He reached out blindly to push it away until the tearing pain in his side cleared his mind of smothering fog. I, he croaked. The voice droned on, unheeding, for an interminable time. Then, Jess! It deafened him. Hey, Colonel, I got him! He's alive! Jess! The voice of Colonel Markley broke in. What happened, Jessup? Then there was a deathly silence. A waiting. I don't know, said Jessup. It's dark out there. The bullseye's dark. Or maybe I can't see. He checked his voice as he sensed its rising pitch. His groping hand found the emergency switch, and the panel lights came on before him like round eyes in the dark. Jessup, what's wrong? Roared the colonel's voice. You've been silent for an hour. We watched you land, but lost you, and now we can't see you. Where are you? He asked himself the question, and the answer trickled slowly into his mind. I'm in a very small, padded place. My head and side hurt like fire. All I can see are those owl-eyed dials. There should be more to see than that. His hand next felt what his eyes now saw, the plastiglass gleam of the bullseye only a few inches from his face. Beyond the transparency was a darkness like the bottom of a mine. I don't know where I am, Colonel, he said finally. It's dark outside. I must have gone over the Terminator. He could sense the Colonel waiting like a trapped hawk. There was only a 3-second time lag, but it seemed like more. It had made itself felt like a growing sense of distance all the way from the station. You didn't cross over, insisted Markley's voice. We saw you land 100 miles safe in sunlight. Can't you even see the stars? The stars? Jessup strained his face toward the little round hole of transparency, and yet he saw nothing. He felt strange, idiotic words rising. Someone's painted it black. I fell in a puddle of ink. What's that? Shouted the colonel. In God's name, man, talk sense. I must have landed in a big shadow and fallen over, said Jessup. That's why it's dark. Apparently you hit on your head, rasped Markley. Look, pull yourself together. You're not in any shadow. You skimmed right into daylight in the middle of Nubium. You saw me land, cried Jessup eagerly. How did it look from up there? You went down from the west, said the colonel, speaking fast. Your jets started over the Altai range. You sailed over Regio, apparently pretty high, and slanted in towards the edge of Pitatus. Your jets blinked out just about 50 miles north of that. That's all we saw. One of the steering vanes blew, and she was going to spin. I had to cut the jets too high, said Jessup, his mind clearing rapidly. Wait a minute, Colonel. I'll see what gives. There was another interval of silence, underscored by the sound of his own laboured breathing. He explored his body with his hands and found many sore spots, but no obvious fractures. He loosened the harness and put his feet on the floor, bracing himself with his hands against the side of the tiny cabin. He stood there for a minute, swaying, before he realized what was wrong. The floor was down. That meant the ship was resting on her tail structure, and so the bullseye above his head should have gleamed with cold stars in fiery sunlight. He placed his hand against a tiny window and clicked on his wrist light. The inner and outer surfaces of the transparency glared back in double reflection. On the outside was a sooty deposit, like a greyish something dipped in candle smoke. First things first, he muttered aloud, and started scanning the instruments. The chronometer showed that Markley had exaggerated. He'd been out only 10 minutes. And he was losing air. Sickeningly, he visualized the mess that must be down below, the jets and undercarriage smashed and twisted. Then Markley's voice interrupted his thoughts. Yes, I see it. The colonel was shouting at someone on the other end. Then his voice became low, hesitant. "Jess, we may have something here. I'm looking at a photo of the spot you went down. I don't see a rocket, but there's a pit that looks different from the rest of the smallpox, like a dent in the hill of sand. I'm afraid to say what it might mean." So that was it. Sand. No, volcanic ash. Of course they had known that parts of the moon would be covered with it. What they hadn't known, what even the space station's telescopes hadn't been able to tell them, was how soft the stuff was and how deep. Jessup felt an ancient horror clutching at him, a horror that should have been totally foreign to the vast sweep of space. He was buried alive. "Like a stone in a puddle of mud," said Markley gloomily to White, the station's second. "Maybe we ought to be thankful. The stuff probably saved his life." "Saved him? What for if he can't get out?" The colonel shrugged his shoulders, his face an expressionless mask for his thoughts. White could sense the tortured anxiety of the older man. More than anyone, he had worked for and pushed Project Moon. He'd never really been a military man. Space was his driving mania. He'd risen to general once, but had been busted for plugging his conviction too hard. And now, in the penultimate moment, this. "How deep could he be and still send?" Markley asked of the man with the earphones. "His signal's weak and distorted. Antenna might be damaged or partly under. At that, I don't know if a few feet of that dust would stop shortwave." "Might be 15 feet, muttered Markley, his face grey and tired-looking. "God, maybe he's still sinking." "Sir, we don't know that he's that deep," cautioned White. "I don't see how an impact would bury him like that." "What do we know of the conditions?" moaned the colonel. "The stuff must be absolutely dry and loosely packed. In the light gravity it probably flows like water. Quicksand. I should have thought of it." "Jessup wants to know if there are any orders, sir," said the radio man. The question might have been phrased with a semi-humorous bitterness, but the colonel answered seriously. "Tell him to give us an estimate to the damage. Ask him if he thinks he can blast out." As the radio man spoke into the microphone, White was suddenly struck with the irony of the situation. Here was the historic moment. They were talking to the first man on the moon. And what did it mean? Where was the thrilling revelation, the sense of triumph? A poor, blind man buried under a mountain of dust. "Jessup says he can't tell much yet about the ship," says the radio man. "He says to hold on." "We'll be out of beam range in 15 minutes, said Markley hollowly, his heavy shoulders hunched forward as if he were trying to reach his arms out to the sunken rocket. White felt the same helplessness. They could not even stop the station in its hurtling chase around the earth. Soon the moon would be lost from sight behind the vast, misty mass of the planet. He became aware of the New Mexico beep call, sounding furiously. He picked the phone up and listened to the angry, excited voice at the other end. Muttering an abject, unmeant apology, he handed the phone to Markley, who made an expression of distaste. "Yes, General. We're going out of range soon. Can you hear him down there?" "No, he didn't crack up. He's buried. We can't tell yet. Yes, buried in the ash. Volcanic ash or meteor dust, I don't know." "I don't know." "Yes, General." "Yes, sir." He slammed the receiver down. "Do they get him at all?" asked White anxiously. "Only a word here and there. They're going to try and clear the air a bit, widen his channel, put a crimp in somebody's TV. If I hear one complaint, I'm dropping a bomb." "We're going out of range now," said Markley's voice in the earphones. "They hear you down below. Keep sending, and good luck." Other voices in the background echoed, "Good luck, Jess." He had a vision of the station's silver disc falling behind the bulging earth as the voices quivered into silence. He stood there for a while, steadying himself with both hands braced on a pressure wheel. "Think," he said aloud, reading from an absurd little cardboard sign in his mind. And immediately he thought of the leak in the hull. What a stupid thing to forget! Already the air pressure gauge glowed a warning red. With a swift, trained motion he poked the smoke button. White tendrils burst out and swirled eerily in the dim light. He watched anxiously as they converged near his feet and vanished, riding invisible currents of escaping air. There he found a bulge in the tough duralumin wall, evidence of a broken stanchion. Quickly he broke out a rubberoid seal pad and slammed it into place over the hole, pressing the edges firmly. Again he pushed the smoke button, and this time the streamers hung uncertainly about. He found there were no more leaks. He drew a deep lungful of the precious air and felt his muscles relaxing, and felt a sudden joyous hope. Since the welded seams of the cabin had held, perhaps even the power plant down below was intact. He had plenty of nuclear fuel. He needed only to get down there to repair the steering vanes, to refill their exhaust mass tanks with the moon's abundant material. Accidents had been provided for. There was a radiation-shielded pressure suit crammed into the tiny but adequate airlock. He had a vision of himself in it, battling the dust like a lunatic. But could he get out at all? If he opened the lock, would he be able to dig his way out, or would the dust flow in faster than he could push it back? It might jam the door mechanism, flow in around him. There was a rustling gabble in his earphones, many voices speaking at once. Now one voice came through more clearly as he clicked up the volume. "Can you hear us, Jessup? New Mexico speaking. Can you hear us? Answer, please. Answer." He felt an overwhelming surge of relief. "Yes," he cried. "Yes, this is Jessup." He repeated it over and over, deafened himself shouting it, until an excited voice answered, "Thank God, we've finally cleared the air. We get you now. Are you all right? Can we help you? The world is with you." Interference howled, rising and falling. Another voice intoned, "Do not despair and turn away from God." Think, think. He slammed his hand against the helmet and the voices ceased. "Think," he said again. What he actually meant was act. He had to do something. The first thing, of course, was to get out of the ship. He could not go down into the radiation-infested hull from the inside. Repairs on the ship's structure, if needed, had to be done from the outside. He had the tools. Jessup examined the darkened porthole again, peering at the dust. Most of the particles were too fine to be seen separately. The residue of uncounted billions of shattered meteorites, fine as face powder. The stuff could be a foot thick above him, or 10. The fact that it was so fine meant that this was the lighter portion, the skim. The heavier particles must have settled lower in the sifting process of 1,000,000 windless eons. Heaven knew how deep it was below him. In panic at the smothering darkness, he threw a switch, flooding the cabin with light. He felt a fierce desire to feel the moon dust in his hands, to grasp at any hope it might offer. There was a safe way. The tiny sample corer had been meant for the moon's rocks and minerals, but it whirred eagerly in his hands as he pushed it into the duralumin wall. The rush of air into the hole made a wet, sucking sound. Slamming a seal pad into place, he examined the tool in his hand. The end of the core drill was filled with dust. Carefully, he shook the particles into his hand. He stared at them a long time, foolishly. There weren't much to see. A few blackish, slippery-feeling grains like pulverized coal. Was this what he had come for? In the tense haste of landing, he had barely seen the sunlit mountains, the panorama of glare and shadow above. Was this little handful of dust to be what he had lived, and most probably given, his life for? He flung it violently against the wall. The motion sent scathing pain into his bruised side. "Cut out the self-pity!" he yelled aloud. Suppressing an impulse to cry out, he banged his helmet again and made the clear, welcome voice from New Mexico come floating back. "What happened, Jessup? What's wrong? We don't hear you. Answer! Answer!" "Why don't you try to get a little sleep, sir?" said White. "We won't be in range for an hour yet." Markley was slumped before the comm-panel, his hands in his pockets. His face was pasty white, the stubble sticking out on it like hoarfrost. "Listen to this," he said, holding up a hand. The radio before him spoke with a smooth announcer's voice. "Colonel Markley of the space station says that every effort is being made to assist Lieutenant Robert Jessup, the first man on the moon. Rescue is still out of the question, but Jessup appears to be in good spirits. He is acting on expert advice, but Colonel Markley says that suggestions from any source will be considered. If anything in your experience can help Bob Jessup, get in touch with your nearest radio or television station, now." Expect anything?" asked White. "No." "Then why?" "It keeps them interested," said Markley. "Interested? Surely." "Surely nothing," cried Markley, with a strange, wild emphasis. "Do you know why we weren't on the moon 10 years ago? The techniques we're using now have been known a good deal longer than that." "It was the cost." "It was the public," snapped Markley bitterly. "The fickle old public. There was a time when the idea of space travel was a fad, when the rockets boomed in every Sunday supplement. We could have had plenty of backing then. But we weren't ready then by quite a few years. We had to build the space station first." "But that was a military necessity." "And a financial calamity. But the public had to swallow it. And maybe because they had to. Because of our lithium bombs and the nervous tension of the war that never did come. The pendulum swung the other way. Now the moon ship's a different matter." "But there was plenty of interest." "To the average man, the moon's still made of green cheese," shouted Markley, waving a hand for emphasis. "Oh, he can quote figures he's read. He can tell you how far it is, how big it is, but it doesn't really connect those figures with the moon out there. It doesn't feel what it is." White knew what the colonel meant. He himself had experienced a peculiar change of viewpoint on it coming to the space station. Call it a change in cosmic perspective. "You can't blame them if they lose interest a little," he said lamely. "It's been nothing but moon in the news for years now. When Jessup landed, they had a right to expect something exciting. This thing is a terrible anticlimax." "They expected the moon brought home to them, I suppose," sighed Markley. "Pictures, descriptions, that sort of thing. All they've got now is a dud firecracker. A small boy on a New York street can see more of the moon than Bob Jessup." "You talked to him last. How was he?" Markley shook his head, slowly, tiredly. "His battery was running low. He hasn't tried to get out yet. Says he thinks the dust will jam the lock. And maybe he's right. Maybe he'd better wait for those suggestions." For the 100th time, White turned Jessup's problem over in his mind. He always thought of it as Jessup's problem, never having been able to identify himself with the midget-sized fanatic who had boarded the moonship. Markley, he knew, had envied the pilot like a shipwrecked sailor envies the free-winging albatross, but not he. That did not mean he didn't want to help. He felt the same desperate longing to help that people have always felt for submarine crews who vainly tap their calls for help on the sides of their sunken vessels. for buried well-diggers or miners caught by cave-ins. But what could anyone do? "I wonder what he's doing now," said White softly. Jessup lay in soft darkness, quiescent. He was in the airlock. Rivulets of sweat ran down his prone body inside the pressure suit, and the incoming air was an icy sword in his back. For 40 hours now the rocket's cabin had been growing warmer as the unseen sun above blazed on the dust. He had turned off the friendly chug-chug of the air conditioner to conserve power, and the heat was becoming unbearable. What was it he had to do? Was it better than roasting alive? Oh well. He kicked clumsily at the pedal which actuated the outer door of the airlock. The door plug scraped unpleasantly on his metal boots as it slid aside. Push. Kick. The legs moved stiffly, like pipe joints. He reached above his head with the suit's clumsy arms and pushed. Slowly the suit scraped outward. He could feel only a soft, yielding resistance on his feet. A wild hope rose within him. Perhaps the dust was loosely packed tenuous enough to tunnel through. Then he was running in a waking nightmare, running in molasses. A soft, yielding something was flowing around his feet, deadly, smothering stuff unseen in the pitch darkness. Panic seized him as first one leg and then the other became stuck fast. Desperately he waved his arms until the suit's mechanical hands caught on the handwheel of the inner door. His wet palms slipped on the manipulators as he tried to apply pressure to turn the wheel which refused to move. He put every ounce of his strength into his arms, and gradually the wheel began to turn. Slowly at first, and then in a rush the door plug moved aside. He clung to the handwheel as an unseen force pushed down at him. Suddenly felt his legs come free as the cabin's outrushing air forced back the dust. When the pressure lessened, he managed to squeeze the bulky suit through the inner door and into the now airless cabin. He fought the door back into place. Safe. Relief was as overwhelming as his panic had been. He stood there for a full minute, feeling nothing but joy and thankfulness that the dust could not come in after him. Then the sting of sweat flowing down his forehead and into his eyes swiftly brought him back to reality. Safe indeed. For what? He had hoped against reason that he could tunnel through the dust to the surface. Perhaps he would soon have roasted to death in the sunlight, but he would at least have stood on the moon. The real moon, not this coffin where he was already dead and buried. But wasn't he on the moon? Wasn't this what he had wanted all his life? Wasn't this what he had come for? What had he come for? It was a question he had never really asked himself in the proper light, with the proper urgency. Others had asked it. That crazy Jessup! I wouldn't be in his boots for $1,000,000. What does he want to go to the moon for? What good's the moon? The men who had said those things had been right, of course. He was crazy. And the question would never be answered, from their viewpoint. For them, the moon was just an ornament, a beautiful ornament in the summer sky. It was strange that he had never been in a position where he had to think out his reasons for coming on the moonship. He'd been too busy fighting for the chance to wonder just why he wanted it. Markley was like him, of course. He wondered if the Colonel would trade places with him right now. Maybe he would at that. Ever since he'd been a kid, Bob Jessup had wanted the moon. Not for himself so much, but for the others. It had been a deep hurt when he met others who didn't want it at all, who didn't even seem to know it was there. To him, it was a symbol of the greater reality, a stepping stone to the stars. His body sagged under the weight of an overwhelming longing. Not to be back on Earth, but to go forward, to show the way. And suddenly he saw the blinding simplicity of the answer. "It's only a paper moon hanging over a cardboard sea." "The moon's still in the news," said White softly, as the strains of the old song floated over the station's bridge. "They're dancing to it," said Markley with an irrational bitterness, "while he's still alive out there." "Do you suppose we'll still be able to receive him? You said his batteries were just about gone." "We'll soon know." The radio man stuck his head into the room. "I focused on Nubium, sir, just out of the horizon." Markley started droning into the microphone. Jessup, come in, come in. Yes, yes." To White, the time seemed endless until Markley turned and said, "His air's gone." He tried to get out and couldn't. "He's speaking through the communicator hookup of his suit, and I can barely hear him." Suddenly the colonel stiffened. Yes, I hear you," he shouted. "You what? But that's crazy. No, I order you not to." He tore the earphones from his head and dived for the tube leading to the radome. White exchanged puzzled glances with the other two men watching, and then followed. Markley was at the telescope, cranking hand wheels, swinging the tube on its airtight joint. The large quartz port showed the moon, nearly full, just rising from the misty horizon. The instant White turned his eyes on it, he saw the flash. The searing blue-white fire was like a glimpse of the sun. Then, from the tip of Mare Imbrium, from the mouth of that ancient pock-marked face, rose a bright plume of smoke. "My God!" cried White. "He's blown himself up!" Quite perceptibly the plume widened, its jet-black shadow crossing the moon's face like a sword cut. Gradually it thickened at the top, still rising like a shining fountain in the sunlight. It was beautiful, but with a beauty surpassed for White by its horror. "Why did he do it?" he groaned, trying to understand. The spectacle possessed him, even as he struggled against it. This was the moonship, all their work going up in a cloud of atomic dust. This was the accident they had all feared, and it hadn't been an accident. Why? Markley looked at him with a face that was old, but with eyes that were strangely bright and proud. "If you don't know why, when you look at that," he said slowly, "you'll never know." Then, stung to anger by White's blank face, he shouted, "Don't you see? He had to do something." Then suddenly White understood. Men like Markley and Jessup had fought against the indifference of men like himself for hundreds of years. Theirs was not a personal ambition. The buried moonship had been a deadly fizzle, so what? A tainted success. This was a spectacle 1 billion people would see and feel. A miracle. The man-made tree grew when nothing had ever grown before, its branches thickening and spreading, hiding the moon's face like a tantalizing veil.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
Project Hush by William Tenn. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, February 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. I guess I'm just a stickler. a perfectionist, but if you do a thing, I always say you might as well do it right. Everything satisfied me about the security measures on our assignment except one: the official army designation. Project Hush. I don't know who thought it up, and I certainly would never ask, but whoever it was, he should have known better. Damn it, when you want a project kept secret, you don't give it a designation like that. You give it something neutral, some name like the Manhattan and Overlord they used in World War II, which won't excite anybody's curiosity. But we were stuck with Project Hush, and we had to take extra measures to ensure secrecy. A couple of times a week, everyone on the project had to report to Psycho for DD and HA, dream detailing and hypnoanalysis, instead of the usual monthly visit. Naturally, the commanding general of the heavily fortified research post to which we were attached could not ask what we were doing, under penalty of court-martial, but he had to be given further instructions to shut off his imagination like a faucet every time he heard an explosion. Some idiot in Washington was actually going to list Project Hush in the military budget by name. It took fast action, I can tell you, to have it entered under miscellaneous X research. Well, we'd covered the unforgivable blunder, though not easily, and now we could get down to the real business of the project. You know, of course, about the A-bomb, H-bomb, and C-bomb, because information that they existed had been declassified. You don't know about the other weapons being devised, and neither did we, reasonably enough, since they weren't our business. But we had been given properly guarded notification that they were in the works. Project Hush was set up to counter the new weapons. Our goal was not just to reach the moon. We had done that on 24th of June 1967 with an unmanned ship that carried instruments to report back data on soil, temperature, cosmic rays, and so on. Unfortunately, it was put out of commission by a rock slide. An unmanned rocket would be useless against the new weapons. We had to get to the moon before any other country did and set up a permanent station, an armed one, and do it without anybody else knowing about it. I guess you see now why we on, damn the name, Project Hush, were so concerned about security. But we felt pretty sure before we took off that we had plugged every possible leak. We had all right. Nobody even knew we had raised ship. We landed at the northern tip of Mare Nubium, just off Regiomontanus, and after planting a flag with appropriate throat-catching ceremony, had swung into the realities of the tasks we had practiced on so many dry runs back on Earth. Major Monroe Gridley prepared the big rocket, with its tiny cubicle of living space, for the return journey to Earth which he alone would make. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hawthorne painstakingly examined our provisions and portable quarters for any damage that might have been incurred in landing. And I, Colonel Benjamin Rice, first commanding officer of Army Base No. 1 on the Moon, dragged crate after enormous crate out of the ship on my aching academic back, and piled them in the spot 200 feet away where the plastic dome would be built. We all finished at just about the same time, as per schedule, and went into Phase 2. Monroe and I started work on building the dome. It was a simple prefab affair, but big enough to require an awful lot of assembling. Then, after it was built, we faced the real problem, getting all the complex internal machinery in place and in operating order. Meanwhile, Tom Hawthorne took his plump self off in the single-seater rocket which, up to then, had doubled as a lifeboat. The schedule called for him to make a rough 3-hour scouting survey in an ever-widening spiral from our dome. This had been regarded as a probable waste of time, rocket fuel and manpower, but a necessary precaution. He was supposed to watch for such things as bug-eyed monsters out for a stroll on the lunar landscape. Basically, however, Tom's survey was intended to supply extra geological and astronomical meat for the report which Monroe was to carry back to Army HQ on Earth. Tom was back in 40 minutes. His round face, inside its transparent bubble helmet, was fish-belly white. And so were ours, once he told us what he'd seen. He had seen another dome. "The other side of Marinubium, in the Rifane Mountains," he babbled excitedly. "It's a little bigger than ours, and is a little flatter on top. And it's not translucent either, with splotches of different colours here and there. It's a dull, dark, heavy grey, but that's all there is to see." "No markings on the dome?" I asked worriedly. "No signs of anyone or anything around it?" "Neither, Colonel." I noticed he was calling me by my rank for the first time since the trip started, which meant he was saying in effect, "Man, have you got a decision to make." "Hey, Tom," Monroe put in. "Couldn't be just a regularly shaped bump in the ground, could it?" "I'm a geologist, Monroe. I can distinguish artificial from natural topography. Besides," he looked up, "I just remembered something I left out. There's a brand new tiny crater near the dome, the kind usually left by a rocket exhaust." "Rocket exhaust?" I seized on that. "Rockets, eh?" Tom grinned a little sympathetically. "Spaceship exhaust, I should have said. You can't tell from the crater what kind of repulsive device these characters are using. It's not the same kind of crater our rear jets leave, if that helps any." Of course it didn't. So we went into our ship and had a council of war. And I do mean war. Both Tom and Monroe were calling me Colonel in every other sentence. I used their first names every chance I got. Still, no one but me could reach a decision. About what to do, I mean. "Look," I said at last. "Here are the possibilities. They know we are here, either from watching us land a couple of hours ago or from observing Tom's scout ship. Or they do not know we are here. They are either humans from Earth, in which case they are in all probability enemy nationals, or they are alien creatures from another planet, in which case they may be friends, enemies, or what have you. I think common sense and standard military procedure demand that we consider them hostile until we have evidence to the contrary. Meanwhile, we proceed with extreme caution so as not to precipitate an interplanetary war with potentially friendly Martians, or whatever they are. All right, it's vitally important that Army Headquarters be informed of this immediately, but since Moon-to-Earth radio is still on the drawing boards, the only way we can get through is to send Monroe back with a ship. If we do, we run the risk of having a garrison force, Tom and me, captured while he's making the return trip. In that case, their side winds up in possession of important information concerning our personnel and equipment, while our side has only the bare knowledge that somebody, or something, else has a base on the moon. So our primary need is more information. Therefore, I suggest that I sit in the dome on one end of a telephone hookup with Tom, who will sit in the ship, his hand over the firing button, ready to blast off for Earth the moment he gets the order from me. Monroe will take the single-seater down to the Riffian Mountains, landing as close to the other dome as he thinks safe. He will then proceed the rest of the way on foot, doing the best scouting job he can in a spacesuit. He will not use his radio, except for agreed-upon nonsense syllables to designate landing the single-seater, coming upon the dome by foot, and warning me to tell Tom to take off. If he's captured, remembering that the first purpose of a scout is acquiring and transmitting knowledge of the enemy, he will snap his suit radio on full volume and pass on as much data as time and the enemy's reflexes permit. How does that sound to you? They both nodded. As far as they were concerned, the command decision had been made, but I was sitting under 2 inches of sweat. "One question," Tom said. "Why did you pick Monroe for the scout?" I was afraid you'd ask that, I told him. We are 3 extremely unathletic PhDs who have been in the army since we finished our schooling. There isn't too much choice, but I remembered that Monroe is half Indian. Arapaho, isn't it, Monroe? And I'm hoping blood will tell. Only trouble, Colonel, Monroe said slowly as he rose, is that I'm 1/4 Indian, and even that. Didn't ever tell you that my great-grandfather was the only Arapaho scout who was with Custer at the Little Big Horn? He'd been positive Sitting Bull was miles away. However, I'll do my best. And if I heroically don't come back, will you please persuade the security officer of our section to clear my name for use in the history books? Under the circumstances, I think it's the least he could do. I promised to do my best, of course. After he took off, I sat in the dome over the telephone connection to Tom and hated myself for picking Monroe to do the job. But I've hated myself just as much for picking Tom, and if anything happened and I had to tell Tom to blast off, I'd probably be sitting here in the dome all by myself after that, waiting. Bros Neggle came over the radio in Monroe's resonant voice. He had landed the single-seater. I didn't dare use the telephone to chat with Tom in the ship, for fear I might miss an important word or phrase from our scout. So I sat and strained my ears. After a while, I heard Mishkashu, which told me that Monroe was in the neighborhood of the other dome and was creeping towards it under cover of whatever boulders were around. And then, abruptly, I heard Monroe yell my name, and there was a terrific clattering in my headphones. Radio interference. He'd been caught, and whoever had caught him had simultaneously jammed his suit transmitter with a larger transmitter from the alien dome. Then there was silence. After a while, I told Tom what had happened. He just said, "Poor Monroe." I had a good idea of what his expression was like. "Look, Tom," I said, "if you take off now, you still won't have anything important to tell. After capturing Monroe, whatever's in that other dome will come looking for us, I think. I'll let them get close enough for us to learn something of their appearance, at least if they're human or non-human. Any bit of information about them is important. I'll shout it up to you, and you'll still be able to take off in plenty of time. All right?" "You're the boss, Colonel," he said in a mournful voice. "Lots of luck." And then there was nothing to do but wait. There was no oxygen system in the dome yet, so I had to squeeze up a sandwich from the food compartment in my suit. I sat there, thinking about the expedition. 9 years, and all that careful secrecy, all that expenditure of money and mind-cracking research, and it had come to this, waiting to be wiped out in a blast from some unimaginable weapon. I understood Monroe's last request. We often felt we were so secret that our immediate superiors didn't even want us to know what we were working on. Scientists are people. They wish for recognition too. I was hoping the whole expedition would be written up in the history books, but it looked unpromising. 2 hours later, the scout ship landed near the dome. The lock opened and, from where I stood in the open door of our dome, I saw Monroe come out and walk toward me. I alerted Tom and told him to listen carefully. It may be a trick. He might be drugged. He didn't act drugged, though. Not exactly. He pushed his way past me and sat down on a box to one side of the dome. He put his booted feet up on another, smaller box. "How are you, Ben?" he asked. "How's every little thing?" I grunted. "Well?" I know my voice skittered a bit. He pretended puzzlement. "Well, what?" "Oh, I see what you mean. The other dome. You want to know who's in it. You have a right to be curious, Ben, certainly. The leader of a top-secret expedition like this. Project Hush, they call us, huh, Ben? finds another dome on the moon. He thinks he's been the first to land on it, so naturally he wants to. Major Monroe Gridley, I rapped out, you will come to attention and deliver your report, now. Honestly, I felt my neck swelling up inside my helmet. Monroe just leaned back against the side of the dome. That's the army way of doing things, he commented admiringly. Like the recruits say, there's a right way, a wrong way, and an army way. Only there are other ways too, he chuckled. Lots of other ways. He's off, I heard Tom whisper over the telephone. Ben, Monroe has gone and blown his stack. They aren't extraterrestrials in the other dome, Ben, Monroe volunteered in a sudden burst of sanity. No, they're human all right, and from Earth. Guess where? I'll kill you, I warned him. I swear I'll kill you, Monroe. Where are they from? Russia? China? Argentina? He grimaced. What's so secret about those places? Go on, guess again. I stared at him long and hard. The only place else? Sure, he said. You got it, Colonel. The other dome is owned and operated by the Navy. The goddamn United States Navy. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. There are lots and lots and lots of stories just waiting for you.